Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Lane Sturdivant. I'm here in Midcoast, Maine. I work for the League of Women Voters of Maine. And along with the League of Women Voters of Alaska, we are hosting these digital democracy discussions on a monthly basis with different speakers who bring different perspectives on the issues that our digital age presents to our democracy. So tonight we have Saurav Ghosh, and Saurav serves as the Director of Federal Campaign Finance Reform for the Campaign Legal Center, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that strives to advance democracy through law. Saurav leads CLC's effort to uncover campaign finance violations, file complaints seeking administrative enforcement, and pursue legislative and regulatory reforms to strengthen and ensure consistent and robust enforcement of federal campaign finance laws. After starting his legal career in private practice, Saurav served almost 7 years in the Enforcement Division of the Federal Election Commission's Office of General Counsel. Saurav also served as a special assistant U.S. attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia and a law clerk for the Honorable John M. Rogers of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. Saurav received his law degree from Stanford Law School and an undergrad from the University of Pennsylvania. And I think in particular, I'm interested to hear about the time you spent, Saurav, in the Federal Election Commission, because we're going to be talking tonight about potential ramifications of AI for campaigns and elections, and also what the CLC and others are recommending that the FEC and Congress do to help prevent some abuses of AI technology when it comes to campaign advertisements. So welcome, and I'm just going to turn it over to you to share a little bit about that topic with us. And then as folks are listening, if you have questions, feel free to throw them into the chat. And afterwards, we'll just have a discussion.
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for having me on tonight. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to speak to all of you. Looks like quite a nationwide gathering. So I'm going to just briefly talk a little bit about the problem, the way we see it, and potential solutions. And I want to leave plenty of time for any questions that you all might have. But I think the best place to start talking about AI in elections is to first think about the broader problem, which is that every election cycle, people are seeing countless political ads, candidates, PACs, and nominally independent groups. They spend billions of dollars, billions with a B, producing and disseminating these ads. And so, that in itself is not a quote unquote problem, but in order for voters to decide how to vote, to meaningfully participate in our democracy, they have to be able to evaluate those ads. They have to be able to make determinations about whether what they're seeing is reliable or credible, and make up their mind about who to vote for and what issues matter to them. So that's where campaign finance laws come in. The laws require that voters have access to the information about who is actually spending money on elections, who's spending money to try and influence their vote, and with respect to the ads, who is speaking to them, who is the actual speaker. And so this is an area where AI can actually make that task very challenging and potentially impossible, because what we are seeing and sort of looking ahead, what we might see in the very near future is political ads that are made using AI that are incredibly realistic. I'm going to step aside for a moment and say, apologies, I woke up a little hoarse this morning, so I'm going to truck through this as best as I can, but I might take a break at points to drink some water or something. So we're seeing these ads that may feature AI to present incredibly realistic but false content. that's used to essentially deceive or manipulate voters as to who is actually speaking. And this is something that would make the voters' job, as in, somebody trying to decide how to vote, incredibly difficult, because they could be looking at, one candidate or who they think is talking to them, but it's actually not that person. It's an AI generated image of that person talking using an AI generated voice that sounds just like that person. And that's just one example. I mean, there's countless ways in which we are already seeing AI implemented in the election space to portray things that didn't happen, or otherwise sort of alter what's being shown visually or heard in terms of audio content. So that's the challenge. And, this isn't really a theoretical situation. We've already seen the ads by presidential candidates and super PACs that feature AI. They include things like one ad that was put out featured former President Trump, who's currently a presidential candidate, hugging Dr. Anthony Fauci. Obviously, that was meant to send some kind of a clear message, but it was fake, right? That never actually happened. You have somewhat more subtle examples, like there was AI used in one ad to essentially create jets flying, military jets flying in the air above a candidate as he was making a speech. Gives a little something extra to the idea that this is a potential commander-in-chief, right? But the actual footage of the event showed there were no jets there. So in ways large and small, AI can very realistically depict something that wasn't there or didn't happen, and can be used to manipulate the voters' reception to that ad and the communication that it's trying to convey. So what can we do about it? CLC's position that actually is laid out in a lot more detail in recent testimony that our president, Trevor Potter, gave before the Senate Committee on Rules of Administration. There's basically three solutions that we see right now. One is legislation that bans the deceptive use of AI in electoral communications. It's always challenging to approach the idea of a content ban, because that is so drastic a measure in terms of saying that something is banned and it can't be used in communications. But I think it's important to take note of the fact that, in the context of AI that is used to deceive voters or essentially misrepresent in a way intended to undermine elections or manipulate voter sentiment, there's no constitutional right to that. And on the other side, there is a clear government interest in maintaining the integrity of our elections and our democratic process. The second solution, which is also involving Congress, is legislation to expand existing disclaimer requirements for political ads, so that an ad that uses AI would have to indicate that on the face of the ad. It's a lot easier for voters to approach an ad with the appropriate level of skepticism about what's being shown if they are made aware, sort of on the face of the ad, that it contains AI and that it is not depicting something authentic or something that genuinely happened. Some of the challenges with these disclaimers that were brought out actually at the hearing are that, AI could be in everything pretty soon. And the example that I've been using very, very recently is that the platform that we're using to have this meeting tonight, Zoom, now has an AI companion. So a month ago, Zoom didn't have AI, as far as I know, and now it does. And so I think we could see AI becoming so integrated into various tools that a simple disclaimer that says AI was used might actually become meaningless because it appears everywhere all the time. So there's some wrestling with this question of like what should trigger what level of AI you should trigger the disclaimer, or what should the disclaimer actually say. It could be a more detailed disclaimer than just AI was used. And that might actually serve more of a function of informing voters that, AI was not only used, but it was used to change what you're seeing or what you're hearing. And the third solution is FEC action. So the FEC, somewhere I spent a number of years working, is the agency principally responsible for enforcing and implementing federal campaign finance laws. And the federal laws currently prohibit fraudulent misrepresentation of campaign authority. That is a pretty narrow category as the law currently defines it, but I think Congress should consider expanding that authority, and the FEC should certainly take what action it can to regulate AI under the existing statutory authority that they have. There was another nonprofit called Public Citizen that recently submitted a petition for the FCC to do a rulemaking and implement some new regulations on this. And just Monday, the comment period for that rulemaking petition closed, and so CLC and other groups submitted comments supporting that rulemaking. Those are not live on the FEC website yet. They've told us they are scrubbing them for PII and other information that needs to be redacted, but they do plan to make those comments public. And if you're interested, our comment is already public on our own website. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say as far as introductory remarks to frame the issue. Certainly Trevor's testimony goes into more detail, and I'd encourage you all to take a look at that. But I want to leave time for your questions, please.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was a really clear review of what I was reading in the testimony earlier, and those three sort of recommendations. I see Sue, if you want to come off mute, you have your hand raised. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you for the presentation and greetings from snowy Fairbanks, Alaska. My question is kind of backing up to the larger issue of false information and campaigns. And even if your CLC's 3 measures are instituted and there's disclosure of use of AI, isn't the introduction of AI just kind of a notch up in order of magnitude of what can be done to produce false information? Because even if those measures are taken, people still can continue to Photoshop pictures, they can splice audio tapes, they can manipulate information to produce basically false information. And it's great if we can contain AI, but isn't the genie already out of the bottle with all the other the access to the technology that allows people to present false images and doctored recordings of people's voices without AI?
Thanks for that question. It's a very good question. So I want to draw a couple of distinctions that are worth keeping in mind. And I think the first is between false speech and sort of fraudulent, manipulative, deceptive speech. I think so, backing up a bit, it's always tempting to say, well, when candidates lie, or when they put out something that they know is false, that shouldn't be allowed, because that's just that's not really advancing the conversation. That's not actually public debate of issues. That's not really the democratic process. Unfortunately, the First Amendment basically protects your ability and right to put out information, even if you know it to be false. So in a certain sense, there is a constitutional right to lie, for lack of a better word. If somebody knows that their opponent is has voted a certain way, or has done certain things in public life, and that would actually help their case to in making the case to voters that they should vote for them. There's nothing illegal, and under my view of the Constitution, there shouldn't be anything to prohibit them from saying, my opponent is soft on crime, or my opponent has never voted to make criminals serve longer sentences, even if they know that to be false, because that's the way that's sort of a line that we shouldn't cross, as far as like banning speech or prohibiting folks from engaging in a robust discussion related to who should be in public office, and what policies are best serving our country. I think what you're getting at, though, is, let's say something isn't just false speech, but it's actually deceptive in terms of who is speaking. And that's sort of the category that these deep fakes get at, right? It's not, me getting on stage and saying my opponent has never voted, but it's actually putting out an ad that shows my opponent saying I have never voted, to make it harder, for criminals to get away with it, something like that. And that's deceptive because I'm showing something that isn't real, and that is basically misleading you about who is actually talking, not what's actually being said. Your question is basically making the point that you could do that even without AI. And I think that's right. And it's something that we addressed in Trevor's testimony, as well as in our comment to the FEC, that there are non-AI tools. Although, as a funny aside, I'll tell you, I was having a conversation just the other day where I used Photoshop as the example of this, and someone said, Photoshop is starting to incorporate AI now, and I said, well, there goes another example. If pretty soon everything's going to have AI powering it. But your point is well taken, and I think the distinction that needs to be made is between manipulation that's sort of facially obvious, of an obviously doctored photo or something like that, and the threat that AI poses, which is you won't even know if it's fake or real. It'll be done so well and so seamlessly with the power of this technology that you can't detect it. So I recognize that it can seem sort of arbitrary to say, well, AI is the problem. But I think AI has presented a new level of the problem, which is, things can be deceptive only if people believe what they're seeing. And this technology makes that a lot easier, cheaper, and in a way that pretty much anybody can do.
Yeah, thank you for that response and for the question, Sue. Jane, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, the impact of images, especially if they are false, even a small statement underneath that says this depicts a fictional event, it doesn't seem like it would offset the impact those images would have. So that's worrisome to me. Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you're getting at the effectiveness of a disclaimer to sort of put the voter on notice. This is, there are studies that show that disclaimers are somewhat effective. I think there are other studies that show that they're less effective than people think. I think in the context, so disclaimers already exist, right? Political ads already have to carry a disclaimer that says who paid for them. So that's the effectiveness that studies that are out there show. Your point is very well taken, that if you show a candidate saying or doing something inflammatory or outrageous, a disclaimer at the bottom that says paid for by their opponent, might go unnoticed. It's sort of the canonical, like a newspaper prints something blatantly wrong and everybody believes it, but how many people actually see the fine print on the correction, that they print the following week? It's a valid concern, and it's one reason why I think the solutions that I outlined in the beginning, and which Trevor talked about in front of the Senate, we describe them as not exclusive or exhaustive. So, I think the ideal solution would be a combination of all these things. A banning of deceptive AI intended to defraud and manipulate voters, and combine that with a disclaimer that says, this was created using AI. And, just to give you an example, I could see that being used in an ad that used AI to just fabricate a scene, but it wasn't necessarily a scene where a candidate was depicted saying something they never said, right? Just a hypothetical scene.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think that leads me to one of the questions in the chat. So the CLC is making these recommendations, as are other organizations, sort of paying attention to what is happening with AI. And we have this big election coming up in 2024 that already feels way too close. So Anne is asking, what are the chances that either the FEC or Congress actually takes action on these issues? And I would add, like, adopts any of these particular recommendations? Like, is one more likely than the other? And so what is the chances that you think this could happen for 2024?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can tell you, let's start with Congress. I'm not a lobbyist. I've never worked on Congress, but in my current role, I get a lot of tidbits of information and insight. And my sense is that the AI issue is a hot issue. People want to talk about it, people want to have hearings about it, and people want to do something about it. The main bill that I'm aware of, and which CLC has actually endorsed, is a bill by Senator Amy Klobuchar, which would ban deceptive AI. And what's really interesting about this bill is that it has bipartisan support. Klobuchar's co-sponsor on the bill is Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri. Strange bedfellows indeed. So, that bipartisan support for that bill, and I think there's others on it, like Susan Collins and a few others that my colleagues who work in legislative affairs would be able to rattle off easily. But it's a very hot issue that people are fired up about on both sides of the aisle. The problem, of course, is that being fired up doesn't mean something gets done. And if you watch C-SPAN today, you saw dysfunction in action because we don't have a Speaker of the House. So there are obvious problems, obvious barriers to seeing legislation actually happening anytime soon. I don't know if that's a good answer, but it's sort of like there's good news, there's bad news. Both are going to factor in. I think the odds of seeing legislation pass before the next election is still pretty remote because of the House. And then that brings us to the FEC. So in theory, the FEC should be, a place that can act much more quickly. But I think part of the problem is the FEC is generally mired in a level of dysfunction and gridlock that is really regrettable. I don't know if the bipartisan support among Congress people, among senators, translates to bipartisan support among the commissioners. I suspect it does not. The brief history of the rulemaking petition was that Public Citizen submitted their petition and it actually got rejected. And at the hearing where the commission rejected it, which never happens, so the first procedural step is that the commission has to approve it, put it out for public comment, and they actually rejected that, and that's just unheard of. And in the comments about that, the commission essentially sounded very skeptical that AI was even something within their bailiwick, to use an old-fashioned word. So I think there's a lot of civil service groups, nonprofits like CLC and Protect Democracy, Brennan Center for Justice, a lot of learned groups on these issues who are urging the FTC to act, but I don't think it's likely to happen. Sorry for the bad news on that front.
Yeah, it's sort of takes the wind out of the sails, knowing that we have this really important election. But it's
I should add one thing though, which is that the federal policymakers are often shirking their responsibilities these days. So we at CLC we tend to joke that if you want to be depressed, talk to me about federal. If you want to feel inspired, talk to my colleagues who work at the state and local level, where actually policies are getting implemented. And I know a number of states have actually tackled AI specifically. So that's a good starting point. Oftentimes we refer to the states as the laboratories of democracy, right? They can pass measures, and the feds can evaluate the successes and failures of those efforts in crafting a solution. So
yeah. So I don't know if you want to expand on any of the state reform. I guess my question about that state reform is, are states passing laws that are for their state and local elections? I'm just wondering about the sort of authority or ability of states to enforce something if they were saying like any election where campaign spending is happening in the state, like buying of ads on social media that target voters in the state, because that seems so broad. But so I guess I just am not aware of the scope of what is happening already for those bills.
sure. So I guess the legal question. So states can only regulate elections at the state and local level.
Gotcha.
There's a preemption issue. Preemption is basically in the Constitution. It says that if there's a federal law that covers the same ground, the federal law wins. So in terms of spending to influence federal elections, that's for better and for worse. That's the FEC's job, and that's Congress's job. But state legislatures can implement campaign finance and ethics rules and laws for state elections, state and local elections. And so some states have done that. A huge caveat to all of this is that, to my knowledge, none of these laws have been challenged in court. And I think some of the laws that we've seen, it just strikes us as potentially vulnerable to a court challenge because of some of the constitutional issues that I discussed earlier. I know Minnesota is one state that has taken this on, and someone was saying to me the other day that Klobuchar's bill seems to be modeled on the kind of Minnesota approach to this issue, which is basically ban the deceptive stuff. I think there's at least another approach, which is more along the lines of disclaimers or some combination thereof. I would, if I could, give you a lot more detail about the state level stuff, but I'm not super familiar with the contours of the different laws.
Well, thank you for that. It's more than I knew going into it. And I think I guess we'll have to keep watching what the states are doing. Let's see, if someone's asking, so if a person defames another person during a political campaign, wouldn't state laws allow for a civil cause of action, notwithstanding that it was a federal race? So again, I guess that federal state preemption relationship.
A little bit, but not really. So defamation is a slightly different thing. Obviously a little outside my area, but I think the easiest way to understand defamation would be, somebody says something that harms someone else's reputation in a way that actually causes them damages, right? Defamation is a tort. Not to use the fancy terms that I learned in law school on you, but a tort is basically a civil lawsuit that hurts you in some way that can be reduced to damages, like actually monetary compensation. So for example, a case that I think a lot of people were following and heard about was Johnny Depp and his ex-wife Amber Heard, right? They sued and countersued each other for defamation. And the nature of that lawsuit is that, Amber Heard said Johnny Depp abused her. Depp said, well, that's false and defamatory. And because she was saying that publicly, I lost out on a bunch of movies that would have paid me multiple millions of dollars. And, Heard's countersuit said, well, because of you saying that I lied, like it harmed me. And so that's the nature of a defamation suit. That is not exactly what is happening in the political arena, which is why defamation suits wouldn't really be the appropriate tool to use in this context, right? If candidate A says, well, my opponent is soft on crime, and candidate B says, no, I'm not, and that's defamation. Like, they might throw that word around because it's a word people know, and it's like, punchy to say, I've been defamed, this is outrageous, but that's not really what defamation is.
All right, let me follow up on that. That was my question. I mean, what if a candidate and their campaign creates a depiction of the opponent that is using AI that is entirely fictitious and makes it appear that the opponent is doing something inappropriate with a young child, for example, and uses that in a political campaign? Notwithstanding that it's a federal race, might that not also be subject to civil action in the state as defamation, and the damages being the loss of the opportunity to run and serve in a federal office?
You're making a good point. I'm not saying that a defamation suit wouldn't be open to the candidate. If somebody did that and it was like, well, not only did I lose the election, but I lost my job and it was all a lie. Sure. And I think you're kind of making the point that there's an opportunity cost, right? I lost an election, so I didn't get the salary and benefits of serving in office. So one other thing to consider is sort of the countervailing problem of, civil lawsuits take time. And, you might say, okay, but enforcing campaign finance laws takes time. Sure, but I think the time in which somebody would actually be able to pursue a civil lawsuit would be a lot longer. And so I think it's a very imperfect tool to address this particular problem. The Klobuchar bill that I mentioned earlier actually contains a provision. So it would not only amend the Federal Election Campaign Act, which is what the FEC enforces, but it contains a provision for a candidate targeted by deceptive AI to seek an immediate injunction. So basically immediate relief in court to have those ads taken down. At the end of the day, I think your point is well taken. Like, how do you unring the bell? It's a problem. And so, in some ways, these efforts to make certain things banned or prohibited, it's an effort to change the incentives, right? So that people don't do it because there will be consequences. That's kind of the nature of accountability in terms of law enforcement. And certainly knowing something is illegal shapes our behavior, right? And that's the goal.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Isn't some of the goal just to confuse people in the first place so that they don't trust what's real either? And I mean, as organizations, how do we even, how do we approach that? What's the answer? Because I think at this point right now, and with 2024, nothing's going to happen. So I think the example that made me think of this was the DeSantis ad. sowing the seeds of everything that's fake. I don't know, thoughts?
Mhm. No, I mean, I completely agree, and I sympathize that it's a problem that's happening now, and solutions seem like they're not only just out of reach, but maybe far out of reach. It's a genuine problem. So, at the hearing, at the Senate hearing where Trevor testified, so I was there with him, and one of the other presenters made this point that, why not counter false or confusing or deceptive speech with accurate speech, right? That's the classic argument about, why we shouldn't ban speech, just, combat false speech with more speech. I think there's an easy response to that in this context, which is that if you can't even tell who's actually speaking, that's a problem, right? You can't, if I put out an AI ad that shows my opponent doing or saying something wildly inflammatory and it looks real, and then my opponent puts out an ad that says that's fake, that's not me, people aren't going to believe that. They're going to believe what they saw. But it's at least something if, organizations, this is kind of probably the worst possible solution, but it is something that organizations can do on their own, which is to sort of like fact check and verify, and let folks that use them as a resource know that like we've looked into this ad and it's fake. So it's not just, the party with a vested interest saying that's not me, that's fake, but it's somebody who's sort of acting as, a reliable source. And I think the media has a role to play in this as well, to sort of attempt to be a little more skeptical or be more of an arbiter and to call out obvious deceptive content when they come across it. But yeah, these are all imperfect solutions, and while I want to give a very realistic sense of what could happen, I agree. I don't think these federal policy solutions are going to happen before the election.
Yeah. So what you just were talking about with this, fact checking, sort of reporting out on false sort of campaign ads that the media and other civic organizations could do. That's one role for civic organizations. There's a question in the chat about what pro-government groups like the League of Women Voters can do to inoculate our processes from mass disruption. So I think I'm just asking, beyond like the fact-checking sort of role, are there other ways that us as civic groups can be involved, especially knowing that the timeline for 2024 means that we probably won't have federal legislation?
I mean, it's a good question. I think, how do you inoculate people from being deceived, right? There's not a vaccine for that. I wish there were. Maybe the best that we can do for the moment is to simply increase awareness that this is happening. And so, we often try to approach political ads with a healthy degree of skepticism, right? Because the person who is putting out the ad, they have an agenda, they have an interest. If it's a candidate, their interest is winning the election, so it's sort of apparent. When it's a super PAC, we don't exactly know what their agenda is, and that's where knowing who paid for the ad is so crucial. So I think elevating, the idea about thinking about what are the motivations behind an ad can be helpful. An ad that uses AI or in a deceptive way or essentially tries to confuse people, it's still got an agenda behind it, and somebody still has to pay to produce it and put it out there. Assuming they do abide by the other laws that are already in the books, the sort of disclaimer laws, the disclosure laws, you can at least see, the statement that says paid for by whoever it's paid for, and look at who are the donors to that group and what are their interests. So if you see an ad that says paid for by Americans for Apple Pie, And then you go on the FTC's website, and it turns out that Americans for Apple Pie is mostly funded by the Koch brothers. Well, you've figured something out about what's in the ad. I wish there was a better solution, but for now, I think that's something that you all can do.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, those are useful tactics and education campaigns to help people think about this as a potential problem for 2024. Raising that awareness, as you said, I think are definitely the league is very good at doing that type of educational work. It's in our wheelhouse.
One other thing, sorry, I just thought of this, but one other category of AI fueled disinformation that we are concerned about is not so much candidate focused, but election focused. So, we are concerned about an AI deepfake of a well-respected figure like, Barack Obama or Michelle Obama or somebody, or an election administrator like the state secretary of state. An ad of them saying, did you know that this year the election will actually be, 50% people vote on Tuesday and 50% vote on Wednesday. Check out, by alphabet, or something like that. Or something saying that, like, did you know that a felony conviction is a permanent disenfranchisement? So if you've ever been convicted of a felony, you can't vote. If you try, you'll go to jail. Ads like that are obviously not targeting any candidate, but could have hugely negative effects on an election. So I think those kinds of ads you actually can confront head on as pro-government groups, and let people know kind of what their rights are. The more people have sort of positive understanding that, like, no, you're not permanently disenfranchised if you were convicted of a crime, or yes, the election for everyone is Tuesday, November, whatever it is. Things like that can sort of be very much like an inoculation. Like, you can have the antibodies ready for when the bad stuff comes out.
Yeah. And before sort of AI was really taking off, I mean, there were still conversations about that type of election administration, like misinformation, and its sort of dissemination through like robocalls or social media. And it makes me wonder about not just the message, but the platform that hosts the message. And I know there was some mention in the testimony about how we can't just rely on social media companies to do their own due diligence. But what do you think, sort of as the CLC, might be roles for social media companies? Can they be helpful in this, and how?
Great question. And it's funny because things are moving so fast in this area that that testimony, we were making the point before our audience, which is Congress, that you can't essentially delegate this to private companies to self-regulate the content that's being put out there. And I firmly still believe that. But at the same time, we know, again, that those companies can implement a policy like that, and it's done. Enforcement of that policy can be uneven and take time to figure out, but the policy itself, they can just pass. They're a private company. Congress doesn't work that quickly. So while I believe that it's a job for federal policymakers, because it's definitely something you want the rules to be uniform, and these social media companies, half of them are invested in AI themselves. It's a really weird incentive structure when you're saying, deceptive AI is banned, but your AI division is like, yeah, this is really hurting our AI use case. Maybe we should let more AI onto the social media platform. So anyway, that's all of the thinking behind why I think government is the right place to adopt these rules. Having said that, actually, the social media platforms have done a good, they're at least exploring the question of how to combat AI-based disinformation. Just this week, actually, I was participating in a roundtable with other all kinds of experts, from technologists to folks like me who are lawyers, hosted by Meta's oversight board, which is currently seeking public comment on their manipulated media policies. In essence, the conversation was very much like the ones we're having about what federal policymakers should do. So it's what should Meta's policy, and Meta, if you don't know, is the parent company of Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp. And so the question is, what should Meta's policies be around AI usage and deceptive media? And going back to an earlier question, it's not just for AI; it's all manipulated media. Though I think very quickly AI will be sort of the most common way in which media is manipulated. So some of the points that I made and that we're planning to make to Meta is just that you guys are sort of at the front line. You don't want your platform to become essentially a hotbed of AI fakes that no one can even tell what's real on here anymore. Some are saying that's already happening on Twitter, or X, formerly Twitter. So I think they're perfectly able to adopt good policies that follow the same track. To ban deceptive AI, require AI disclaimers. These are things that they very much can do. And again, I think they have a different incentive, but I think it's still a good incentive, which is they want to maintain the quality of their product. And if it becomes a bad place to go for information, or a place that is just known for being unreliable, that hurts their bottom line.
Yeah. And kind of continuing on about social media, we haven't talked much about targeting as another way that AI can sort of affect campaign ads, but it's mentioned in the testimony that AI can be used to sort of scrape user data and then very much be like, this is the specific message for you. And I guess I'm wondering if there's a role either for legislation and or social media companies in sort of interrupting the process somewhere around like that use of data or the application of that targeting. And maybe I don't know a lot about social media. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the targeting piece is definitely important. For right now, it feels like a sort of downstream concern, because targeting is how an ad gets served up to you, or not served up to you. So what you're seeing on social media, what you're seeing in general, even on your TV or streaming platforms, is based on data about you or your household, or some other like block of data. And so the theory is that AI can turbocharge that targeting process, so that, for instance, we all have these, and so ads delivered to you on your phone could in fact be targeted just to you based on your specific preferences, interests, level of engagement with different issues. I think that's definitely concerning, but it's a lot less concerning than the sort of wildly deceptive stuff that AI could be used to do in terms of the actual content. So I think, I want to see AI in that area regulated as well. There's also, some privacy concerns there. Like, people are generally voicing concerns with what data about me is AI able to scrape and use to figure me out. So I think there's going to be a conversation about that, and I think policies will be needed, but I think the immediate threat to our elections is more on the side of like deceptive content.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we have a sort of question here. Maybe this could be our final question, perhaps, unless anyone has anything else that they want to throw in the chat. Anne says, you're scaring the crap out of us. Is there a coordinated effort among pro-democracy groups to push back on this sort of dystopian 2024?
Yeah, and sorry if I'm scaring the crap out of you. In some ways, maybe that's a good thing, because when we're, you know, scared about a situation, we are motivated to act. Certainly the worst possible outcomes are just that. They're possible outcomes. And so I think we are trying to think them through so that the solutions that we're crafting can take those into account. That does not mean that they will definitely happen. And in some ways, talking about them and elevating awareness about them helps them not to happen, because I don't know, you know, it's like the bad guys are out there thinking of the ways in which to do bad things, but if their idea is already out there being talked about, then you know it's less effective to deceive people in ways that they're sort of aware could have happened. So that's the caveat to, you know, this could happen, is that I think it's still just a theoretical possibility. Is there a coordinated effort? There is. Pro-democracy groups like CLC and you know, Brennan Center, Protect Democracy, Crew, Common Cause. We talk. We try to figure out what our, you know, shared goals are. Certainly, election protection, integrity, avoiding disinformation. These are universally understood as really, really important goals. I think if 2016 taught us that foreign interference was a real threat and possibility, and 2020 taught us that, you know, we shouldn't even take the democracy, the democratic result of an election being respected, we shouldn't take that for granted. You know, I think what we're learning in the lead up to 24 already, even though the election hasn't happened yet, is that these are very real threats and we need to take them seriously. And so our coordinated effort is to kind of have this conversation, elevate these issues. And I think it's paying off. I mean, I think I won't say that we deserve all the credit. I think, you know, certainly Congress is talking about doing something, as I said, in a way that is hard to create organically. You know, it sort of happens when it happens. But we're certainly doing what we can to pour gasoline on that fire that's burning already to get them back.
Yeah, thank you. I know I said that was sort of the wrap up question, but I did have one other one that occurred to me was we're looking in the US, we're looking toward 2024 as our big presidential election and sort of upcoming timeline. Are there other countries that we should be looking at who are also having elections, or are already sort of a step ahead of us in thinking about dealing with AI in elections, along with like potential state state legislation? Are there places that we should keep an eye on?
So I'm not aware of any specific countries that have sort of implemented safeguards against AI use in the scary ways that I've talked about. But as I said, that's not something I usually focus on. So it may be happening. Certainly, I think as a general rule, Europe tends to be pro-regulatory in a way that the US will never be, in a good way. I mean, I think they take things like consumer protection, elections, they take these things seriously. So I would keep an eye on Europe to answer your question, but to my knowledge, they haven't done anything yet.
All right, so we'll have to wait and see, both for Europe and for us, how it all shakes out. But this was very informative, and I think very useful for us, and things we can take this knowledge and keep raising awareness within our own sort of organizations and networks. So really appreciate your time here laying it all out, the problem and the potential solutions, both. And thanks everyone for listening in.
Thank you very much.